Hey everyone, so this week the material that we're going to be focusing on is building on the material we covered last week about data types. And we're going to look at functions. Functions are essentially the verbs of our programming language, right? So we've now covered covered the nouns, and we're going to talk about functions, which are the verbs, and also conditionals and loops, which are sort of the two main grammatical structures of programming. In fact, I'm tempted to say they're the only grammatical structures in programming, right? So basically, these functions, conditionals, and loops are the three things that allow us to manipulate our data types in such a way that we can, get things done with our programs, right? So I'm going to start out here. This is the folder that I created last time that has my repo in it. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to right click here and choose Open with Aptana, which is just kind of an easy way to make sure that I'm in my existing GitHub repo. Of course, you are welcome to start a new repo if you like. It's really up to you all. One of the nice things about sticking with the same repo is that you can sort of see how your assignments evolve over time, but it's really up to you. So here I am. Now, I didn't really do anything with this in here, but you may remember from last time that we had our script examples, and for your assignment, you guys were doing things like creating a string variable, right, and also creating a number, right? Oops, I don't want that as a string, I want that as a real number. Right, and we experimented with console logging, right, which is the way that we can, use, which is actually a function, right? So the log function is actually a function, and basically there are a couple of different types of functions. There's so-called built-in functions. So I'm just going to put this in here. So built-in functions, or native methods, they're sometimes called. So a function and a method are really the same thing. Sometimes we say native methods, and what we mean is something that the programming language, the computer already knows how to understand and interpret. Right, so basically the point here is that the log function, right, which is this bit, right, console log is a function that the browser already knows how to execute, right? And so for each of our data types, we have a number of functions that are built in, and then on top of that, we can create our own functions. So console log some string, whoops, again, not in quotation marks, some string, we know will output. So now if I open this with, I'm going to actually open it with Chrome, but if I open this in a browser, and I use my inspect element, and look at the console, you can see that this has been output here. So in your assignment for last week, you guys looked at building some more complex data types. We've looked at things like objects and arrays, and we also looked at, oops, this should say built-in. We looked at objects and arrays, and we also saw how you can compose objects and arrays together to make something like, for example, an array of objects. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to perform a really fun task in which we are going to sort cookies. We're going to imagine that we're going to create an array of cookie objects that has different properties, and then we're going to find a way to make sure that we separate our favorite cookies from the ones that we don't like as much. So this may seem like kind of a silly example, but it's going to give us an opportunity to look at conditionals, which are if-else statements. They're logical statements that let us say if something is true, then do one thing, and if it's not true, do something else. And loops, which basically are just a way of stepping through a list, stepping through an array, and looking at all the objects in the array. So we're going to start out by creating our object here, and I'm going to call this cookie list. Okay, and because it's a list, I'm going to have these. I'm going to have the square brackets, And then within that, I'm going to create a set of cookie objects, right? So sometimes I like to do this. I kind of work outside in. Let's give ourselves 5 cookies to choose from. And I'm going to make these pretty simple objects. I'm just going to say, look, it has a type, and there's going to be chocolate chip, and there's going to be, oh, what else? Let's see, we could have chocolate chip, we could have oatmeal raisin. Now I want you to note that when I'm creating these properties, I'm still following, our general rule of not having any special characters or spaces. Sometimes we can't avoid that, but in the cases where we have the opportunity to create our own objects, it's always smart to do things like avoid spaces and special characters. And the reason why is it just gives us a more consistent chance. What we're going to need to do, right, is when we try to sort these cookies, when we try to choose the cookies we like the best, we're going to need to be able to compare the type to some types that we've defined, right? If we decide that our favorites are chocolate chip cookies, we're going to need to be able to do a comparison there. And in point of fact, one of the reasons why white space can be problematic is because Macs and PCs actually interpret white space slightly differently sometimes. And so it just keeps us in that safe zone of knowing that, if we don't have any spaces, we don't have any special characters, we can be pretty much guaranteed that this is going to perform the same way on every system, and not get kind of caught in some of the lower level details that can cause problems otherwise. So I'm going to call this chocolate chip. I really should know really should know more about, we'll call these Linzers. And what's another kind? Shouldn't be so hard to think of different types of cookies, right? Well, let's make this one chocolate chip as well, okay? So we now have a list of cookies, and what we want to do is we want to look through this list, and we want to, so this is another thing that we're going to do. You guys did this at the beginning of your assignment, your sort of story assignment around data types. I'm going to do this too, which is that I'm going to describe what I want this program to accomplish in the comments at the top of the file, right? And this is good to have as a reminder. We always like to start with kind of a list of what we're trying to do, write out the steps that our program needs to follow, because it's very easy as you're kind of dealing with all the details of structuring, I need to write an object, and these we can get kind of lost in the details there. So it's good to have a list of steps that you need to follow that you can refer back to in order to kind of check, when you finish one part of it, what's the next thing, right? Basically understanding that, this isn't the sort of thing that we do all at once. We do it in stages. So the purpose of this program is to sort a list of cookies. Actually, I'm going to say it's to select all the chocolate chip cookies, and I'm going to specify here that the type equals choc chip from a list of cookie objects, and put them in their own list. The remaining cookies should also be put in their own list. Okay, so that's the basics there. That's what we're trying to do. So of course the first step is to create my cookie list object. Right? And the second thing that I want to do is I need to create a place for the cookies that I like and the cookies that I don't like to go, right? So if we go back to this description, we can see that I want to select all the chocolate chip cookies from a list of cookie objects. So I want var selected cookies. Okay, and that's a list that right now is empty, right? Because in order to actually put things in it, we have to go through this first list. But we need to have a list that we can put them into. So we're going to designate, we're going to say, look, create a box in memory, that's that var, called selected cookies. And that's going to be a list. It's going to be an empty list for now, and we'll add things to it. And same thing for the rest of our cookies, basically. We're going to call them leftover cookies. Okay? So we've now created two lists. So lists and add our cookies to as we test to see if they are chocolate chip, right? And there we go. So now we're coming to the part of how do we tell the computer that we want to look at each individual item in this cookie list one at a time, right? We don't have a way to sort of directly just say, hey, give me everything that has this. Right, we have to actually, like the computer is not very good. We have to tell the computer explicitly, I want you to take this list and I want you to look at each item in it one at a time and see if it has a particular property. And if it does, if it has a property I want, then I want you to add it to the selected cookies list. And if it doesn't, then I want you to add it to the leftover cookies list. And so this is where our loop is going to come in. So create a loop that steps through the cookie list one item at a time and then test each item to see if it has a type, if its type is chalk chip. Okay, so we now have what we would call the pseudocode for our task. And from here, it's basically just a question, it's just a question of translating into regular code. But I really, really want to emphasize the importance of this pseudocode. Again, the pseudocode that we put in the comments is part of what helps us define our tasks. And it gives us something to refer back to in case we get lost in the code. So we'll come back in a couple minutes. We're going to write our for loop, which will also contain a conditional, and we'll see how we can use this to actually manipulate our cookies and leftover cookies lists. All right, see you in a minute.